to part 2. Let's continue on, and we're going to cover these 5 areas. You can take some notes. Make sure that you look at the websites on the worksheet and you add in your extra notes or additional notes, all right? So you do need to watch the videos and read the articles there as well. That's really important. I'm just going to give you a brief summary of each of these sections. So in this first website that you're going to be looking at, it talks about how Addis Ababa's infrastructure development is moving vertically because of the protected farm areas that that restrict its development outwards. And so we can also note that the rapid urbanization of Addis Ababa has led to a rise in poverty as well as social inequality. The development of these condos, these high-rise apartments, it's really similar to the Chinese architecture and infrastructure, and that's because it has been built by Chinese companies. The interesting thing, though, about the value of the apartments is that the lower level, the ground level, is the most expensive. And the reason being there are regular power outages that lead to the elevators not working. And so people who live on the 50th floor, for example, would actually have to climb the stairs. So it does give you an idea of some of the challenges in terms of infrastructure development that Addis Ababa faces. This information here highlights the level of investment that China has in Ethiopia and in lots of African nations. But essentially, China has invested about $12 billion US dollars into Ethiopia's infrastructure, and primarily in these residential buildings, but also in the transportation network. So, for example, an $86 million ring road, the Gotera intersection, greatly helped to reduce traffic congestion. Ethiopia's first 6-lane highway, which cost $800 million, the Ethio-Djibouti railway line, helped Ethiopia as a landlocked country connect it to a port, which is really important to help boost its economy. And so we can see that these projects happened between 2010 to 2014, and some of them are still taking place. Most recently, we are seeing more green infrastructure developments in the Piazza and Arat Kilo corridors. These are in the northern regions of Addis Ababa. We're seeing these parks, green spaces, and bike lanes to improve walkability here. But back to the grey infrastructure that we're talking about, the 2011 to 2015 was the light rail transit. And before this, people really relied on the Blue Donkey, which was a minibus taxi, as well as buses that were owned by the government company called Anbessa, so a state-owned company. So the suburban, this was a big deal, the light rail network. It's the first sub-Saharan African nation to have a light rail network. It cost US $475 million. It was the first of its kind in Sub-Sahara. 32-kilometre light rail project carries 55,000 passengers per hour, and there were 39 stations across the city when it opened in 2015. The China Railway Engineering Group, as well as the Shenzhen Metro Group, were the companies that helped to design, engineer, maintain it. And in terms of the cost, it's relied on an 85% loan from the Export-Import Bank of China and the remaining funds sourced from the government. Was there anything else I want to talk about here in terms of transport? So you want to think about this from our theories that we've covered. So does this transport investment lead to centrifugal or centripetal movement? Does it attract more people to the city, helping to reduce the congestion? Does it make it easier for people to move between the areas around the city. So the ring roads that have been developed also help to reduce the pressure on the urban centre as well. So the government has heavily invested in these centralised projects, but also, okay, so think about that. And then in terms of sanitation, water and waste disposal, this is a serious issue because it's not evenly distributed in terms of its services. The slum areas in particular do not have adequate drainage systems. Of course, they're informal settlements, and so the sanitation becomes a huge health risk. But in general, 60% of food consumed in Addis Ababa is irrigated with untreated wastewater, making food poisoning a common occurrence. And altogether, it costs $700,000 in medical costs each year, and that's not even accounting for the people who are no longer productive at work and have experienced unemployment as a result. The mountainous topography and lack of infrastructure basically make it really hard for the water to be piped to houses, but also the water storage capacity is only 30%. When we compare it to Australia, we're at an 80% storage capacity. But there's a 838 millimetre average rainfall each year, whereas in Australia we have a 500 millimetre average. And so even so, it's about the it's about the infrastructure that's in place and the fact that, there are large water reserves that Ethiopia can draw upon, but without the adequate infrastructure, they aren't able to do so. There was an El Nino event in 2017. 42 million people didn't have access to safe water sources, with 8,500 children under the age of 5 dying every year due to diarrheal diseases caused by contaminated water. It just shows how big of an issue it is. There are some projects that are being developed. The $150 million Jerby project, where will aim to supply 80,000 additional cubic meters of water. So you can have a look at that article there. But some of the issues here include the topography, as I said before, the 44 main pumping stations that reach inhabitants in different corners of the city using 8 kilometers of pipelines make it challenging to distribute the water because of the topography. Most of the water that Addis Ababa residents access is from the ground, but then there's also 3 dams that are used. So when we look at the most vulnerable, they're children living in the slums. But, there's also the problem that only 10% of the water is piped into homes, and 52% have access to improved water, and the other 50% do not. It becomes more challenging due to internal migration, because oftentimes rural to urban migrants settle in the slums and in poor urban areas with cheap accommodation, leading to overcrowding and increased pressure on these scarce resources. Waste disposal. So 2,400 to 3,000 tonnes of waste is generated per day. 15% is recyclable, but only 5% is recycled, and only 5% is composted. Households generate about 75% of the waste. Households, 20% of the water bill goes to waste collection fees, whereas for businesses it's 42.5%. And this leads to the lack of incentive to dump the waste legally because of the fees that they have to pay. And so around a quarter of the waste is dumped illegally. Waste collection is handled by micro and small enterprises. So the municipalities compensate micro and small enterprises based on the volume of the waste they collect. Therefore, there's no incentive for these enterprises to segregate the waste because they don't factor that in. And so there's no monetary incentive for either households or the enterprises to dispose of waste sustainably. All right. In terms of telecommunications, there is a digital divide between the urban and rural areas of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, but also in different areas of Addis Ababa as well. Ethio Telecom is the only telecommunications company. It is government owned and therefore holds a monopoly over all telecommunications services in Ethiopia. There was a recent parliamentary review that raised concerns about Ethio Telecom's inconsistent services and reliability, the gap between urban and rural access, and the high costs in its offerings. Because it's the only company, then it can essentially hike its prices, and there's nothing that people can really do about that. So the major coverage gaps occurred in the regions like Amhara, Oromia, Benishangul Gumuz, and southern Ethiopia. And the main issues experienced there, the main barriers are infrastructure, land access, and funding issues. Right. So although it served nearly 81 million customers, including 78 million mobile subscribers, it has goals, and you can read them here. And that's essentially it I just wanted to quickly share with you a timeline as well. We can see in the 1900s, there was the construction of the first few roads. And then over time, around the 1970s, which was also when the Chinese partnerships began, there was also the nationalization of the bus service. But then in the 2000s, we see rapid development in infrastructure that also helped fuel the population growth in the urban centers. And then some additional projects that are to take place. All right, let's keep going. How do I keep? All right, so the question, 10-mark question for you to consider. The patterns of urban infrastructure growth. Examine the patterns of urban infrastructure growth that have developed in one named city over time. When we think about urban growth, look at the urban growth model. Think about the inputs. Okay, a lot of foreign investment in terms of energy, resources, water, in migration, contributing to the city's processes. As we said before, large secondary industry, so heavy and light manufacturing, construction, textiles, leather, boots, that sort of thing. And then a lot of great infrastructure development. Over time, we're seeing more green infrastructure development as well, leading to all of these urbanization, urban growth, intensification, industrialization, planning. These are all of the ones that you want to consider. So here's some ideas. Think about centrifugal or centripetal movement. Start putting into practice what we've covered in the last two videos as well. You can even link it to population. A lot of this investment, why are countries investing in Ethiopia? They see the potential for it to achieve the demographic dividend with a large young growing population, a large proportion of the population is in the working age. So consider all of these things. There's also, green infrastructure projects you want to look into. Water and sanitation is still unevenly distributed. 24% of people are below the poverty line. A lot of informal settlements. A lot of investment is mainly in physical infrastructure. So think about all of these things. Core regions and periphery. Have a think about that. So I'll stop this here.